While the federal bureaucracy has considerable influence, it is subject to constraints that limit its power and independence. In addition to procedural constraints, such as following rules established for hiring and firing employees, or procuring goods and services, there are 5 major legislative constraints on bureaucratic authority. First among them is the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, which established protocol for adopting a new rule or policy. Additionally, it requires agencies to notify affected parties and solicit feedback before approving the new rule or policy. Another legislative constraint, the Freedom of Information Act, has been used frequently by journalists since being passed in 1966. It gives citizens the right to inspect all government records not containing military information, classified intelligence, trade secrets, or private personnel information.
The head of each agency shall prepare and make publicly available upon request reference material or a guide for requesting records or information from the agency, including an index of all major information systems of the agency, a description of major information and record locator systems maintained by the agency, and a handbook for obtaining various types and categories of public information from the agency. The Freedom of Information Act.
A third constraint concerns the environment. Before initiating any action affecting the environment, agencies are required by the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 to issue an environmental impact statement. The Privacy Act of 1974 is yet another constraint imposed on the federal bureaucracy, mandating that agencies keep government files about private citizens confidential. It includes information such as Social Security files and tax records.
Each agency that maintains a system of records shall maintain in its records only such information about an individual as is relevant and necessary to accomplish a purpose of the agency required to be accomplished by statute or by executive order of the President. Privacy Act of 1974.
The fifth and final legislative constraint, the Open Meeting Law of 1976, states that all government agency meetings must be open to the public unless military information or trade secrets are being discussed. Once a bureaucratic agency has conformed to the necessary legislative constraints, there are still executive constraints to consider. Presidents have 2 methods for overseeing agencies: budget proposals and direct inquiry, but neither has been consistently effective. Lack of cooperation and communication has historically caused tension between the executive branch and the bureaucracy. Yet, if a president's appeal for bureaucratic cooperation fails, he still has several options. One is calling for the department or agency head's resignation, a move used only when that person is the sole impediment to White House proposals. Other times, a cooperative department or agency head is burdened with an uncooperative staff. Threatening future funding cuts or investigation is another option the president can employ to encourage agency cooperation. Funding cuts can be counterproductive, though, due to the White House's reliance on the department or agency to implement its policy. The threat of investigation is more effective, but usually requires congressional cooperation. If the president is a forceful advocate of his own agenda, he can also use his power of personal persuasion and presidential authority to promote agency action on his programs. Agencies overcoming all procedural, executive, and legislative constraints still face another impediment: each other. The overlapping functions of agencies limit the independence of any single agency. The Customs Service, Drug Enforcement Administration, and the FBI are all involved in controlling the trafficking of drugs, for example, making the activities of the agencies interdependent. This interdependence is not without consequences. It can take longer to get things done when multiple constraints must be satisfied. Agency actions may be inconsistent when efforts to satisfy one constraint conflict with another constraint. Agencies hesitate to take action because they must be receptive to public comment. And ultimately, all of these consequences lead to one thing: public complaints about bureaucratic red tape. In addition to the numerous constraints placed on bureaucratic agencies, they must submit to congressional budgetary oversight, the single most effective method for constraining bureaucratic authority.
If we compare the power of Congress and the President over the bureaucracy, it becomes clear that they both have important constitutional responsibility. Congress retains primary control over the organization of the bureaucracy. It alone creates and destroys agencies and determines whether they are to be located within the executive branch or outside it. Peter Wohl.
Congress has three important powers over the bureaucracy. First, no agency may exist without congressional approval, and Congress can eliminate uncooperative agencies. Second is the power over spending. No agency can spend money without congressional authorization. Without authorization, an agency goes bankrupt. And the third congressional power is also funding related. No money can be spent unless Congress approves an appropriation. In other words, if an agency's spending request isn't part of the budget the President submits to Congress, funding can be withheld. Congressional oversight can take several forms: budgetary review, controls on personnel, even investigations and public hearings. It must be used wisely, though. Congress relies on agencies to create and enforce its laws, so the power of oversight must be balanced against the need for collaboration on implementing policy. The judicial branch must also take a balanced approach when dealing with bureaucratic agencies. It is the only branch with the power to impose and eliminate constraints. In 1983, the Supreme Court intervened in INS versus Chadha, a case involving a dispute between the Immigration and Naturalization Service and Congress. In a landmark ruling, the court struck down the legislative veto, effectively eliminating Congress's power to overrule bureaucratic decisions.
Today, the court not only invalidates 244(c)(2) of the Immigration and Nationality Act, but also sounds the death knell for nearly 200 other statutory provisions in which Congress has reserved a legislative veto. For this reason, the court's decision is of surpassing importance. Supreme Court Justice Byron White.
Legislative, congressional, executive, and judicial constraints all serve as checks on the bureaucracy, but the agencies are far from powerless. Iron triangles, or sub-governments, are coalitions that can be created between an agency, the congressional committee or subcommittees that govern it, and the affected interest groups. An iron triangle begins with committee members showing favor to the interest groups in exchange for votes and campaign contributions. This is called capturing the agency. The agency, in turn, favors the committee in exchange for support and budget appropriations. A glaring example of client politics, iron triangles can also produce positive results. They help ensure that the laws Congress passes are effective and practicable. They guarantee interest groups a say in the creation of legislation affecting their members. To an extent, they even let Congress lean on outside experts to ensure that it writes legislation that will accomplish its goals. Political scientists speculate that iron triangles are dying out. In their minds, the growing numbers of interest groups with competing interests are decentralizing Congress. Contemporary agencies, they argue, have become issue networks. Comprised of interest groups, congressional staffers, advocates from university think tanks, and members of the media, issue networks debate policy while focusing on the promotion of their respective political philosophies. Iron triangles or issue networks, it is clear that bureaucratic agencies continue to seek ways to balance the numerous constraints placed on them by all branches of government. Ultimately, their fight to maintain the balance of governmental power helps assure the continuation of democracy in America.